this week's presentation, Food from the Hood, Converting Inner City Land to Farms, presented by Skip Weiner. In 1989, Skip, a native of West Philadelphia, began to run children's garden and farm programs. Over 2 decades, 7 acres of overgrown, derelict, open-air drug markets were converted to ecological teaching and learning gardens and inner-city farm production. Parents and grandparents joined their children, and the first Philly Black low-income co-op was born. Thousands of pounds of food were harvested and sold annually at low-income farmers' markets. Children were raised safe from drug gangs. The Black community was having its first dialogue about food-related diseases, diabetes, high blood pressure, and asthma. Together, we're going to explore the use of this community development model for Lakeside. Skip has a master's degree in plant physiology and landscape architecture. He worked for the New Jersey Department of Environmental Protection, the National Park Service, and Rain Camp Consultants. Please welcome Skip.
Can you hear me? This is good. I thought when I first was going to do this that I would talk about what happened in West Philadelphia, and it's a fairly personal story about how this whole organization developed. But everybody has said all of a sudden maybe we should consider this model for Lakeside. But in order to do that, I think I need to describe what I went through and what happened, and whether some of these components that happened to me are really valuable and possible here at Lakeside. I came about creating the Urban Tree Connection in 1989 when I lost a job, and I had had fairly significant jobs, fairly traditional desk jobs in New Jersey Environmental Protection Agency. I wrote the Coastal Zone Management regulations to kick wealthy people off the barrier islands when storms came. That was a disaster. We looked at the Thousand Islands area for inclusion of the National Park Service. When I was at Grand Camps, I was a project manager and did fairly spiffy things. We did the master plan for Hilton Head Island. A lot of these things were capacity-driven master plans. How can you keep people from crossing the bridge? The bridge has to be backed up. How do you keep people from living in Hilton Head Island over the capacity of the island? Well, the sewage treatment plant has to be able to accommodate all of those people. And I did fairly sophisticated master planning, Hilton Head Island, Saco, Maine, Millville, New Jersey. And then I interviewed for a job in Buffalo to get a master plan with Grand Camps. And I loved the interview. It really was a disaster. And came back to Philadelphia, and John said, patted me on the back and said, he thinks it's time that I, leave. And he gave me my marching orders. And working at John's was like getting a walking PhD. It was extraordinary. He was a gifted land use planner. I had gotten my landscape degree at Penn under kind of a guru, a guy that was called the father of ecological planning, Ian McCarr. And Ian, this goes to social justice issues. Here I was, I'm a learning disabled kid, and I don't do things, I don't read well, I don't, you give me a column of numbers and I add it up 3 times and I get a different number every time I add it up. So my approach was very visual when I went to do things and solve problems. And Ian took us up to Wilkes-Barre, and against all the advice of a lot of people in the landscape architectural department that he was running at University of Pennsylvania, he was very clear about the connection between design and health. So he was having us study black lung disease and the proximity of housing and community centers, and he was very highly criticized. I didn't pay much attention to this and had all these jobs, and then all of a sudden found myself in '89 out of a job And I heard that there was work in Chester, Pennsylvania, which is below Philadelphia's airport, and it's about 30% unemployment. Its claim to fame, it has a soccer field, a penitentiary, and a casino. That was their solution to this unemployment situation. And I started to hang out with kids in the middle school, teenage, preteens, and teens, and we inventoried all the vacant lots in Chester. And then I went to Washington. They were giving away trees, the National Tree Trust. It was a Superfund site that had a $20 million fine associated with it, and they set up a tree nursery giveaway. This was in the 80s and 90s. And so you could get as many tree seedlings as you wanted. So I paired the kids, the vacant lots and the tree seedlings, and we started to grow tree seedlings on vacant lots. At the same time, I was experimenting with school teachers in the Philadelphia School District, where the teachers, instead of wanting to do classroom work, were interested in taking the kids out into the community and using the community as a classroom. This concept, you need to stop a second and think about this. All my life, I struggled with trying to figure out what I was supposed to be doing in the classroom, given the fact that when I opened the book, I really couldn't read, I really couldn't write. So it was a very logical movement for me to say, okay, let's take kids out into the streets and let's have a discussion about issues and let's use the community as a classroom. In Germantown High School on Germantown Avenue, when we did that, we ended up having the kids run a conference on drug activity on the commercial corridor. We invited all the shopkeepers into the school, and the kids actually ran the conference on discussions of how to control these activities. All right, fast forward. I started in my childhood neighborhood to notice that there were extraordinary numbers of vacant lots. Philadelphia during the 40s and 50s, post Second World War, really lost a lot of its manufacturing plants. And when the manufacturing plants left, the labor force left behind it, and the houses were left. And most of these neighborhoods illegally were redlined, so you couldn't get a mortgage, and the houses decayed, and the city didn't have the money to manage these houses, and eventually the houses had to be knocked down because they were extremely dangerous, and that created a vacant lot. The city used to throw some soil on the vacant lot, and weeds used to grow up. This happened over a period of decades in Philadelphia, producing, this is not an uncommon thing for inner cities, Detroit being a prime example. It created about 40,000 vacant lots. And the city being incapable of managing all those vacant lots, in the really low-income sections of the city, these lots became harbingers of drug activity, and they were really very dangerous places. So when I started, actually, the school district was in such bad shape in Philadelphia. It's the fourth largest school district in the country. It was taken over by the state for fiscal mismanagement. And the William Penn Foundation, because all of these after-school programs and music programs and gym programs disappeared, the William Penn Foundation identified 5 high-crime neighborhoods in Philadelphia. And West Philadelphia, Haddington, where I lived, was one of them. And they asked nonprofits to work with kids, and they wanted us in West Philadelphia to work with a minimum of about 1,000 kids every year. There were about 10 nonprofits, and they invited me to work in that council of nonprofits. I went into the local church, looked at all these kids in front of their computers, and sort of raised my voice and said, anybody want to go outside and tired of sitting in front of the computer? I got about 5 kids who said, you know, enough of the computers, we're going outside with you. And this was the next like really important issue in maintaining and continuing this dialogue. It's called constructivist education. I would turn to the kids and I would say, a little bit of a white lie, I know nothing about this neighborhood, nothing. And I need you to explain this neighborhood to me. I need you to explain, you know, where the good stuff happens, where the bad stuff happens, where the block captains are, where your buddies are, your walking route to school, have you ever gotten beaten up, where the drugs are, and if there are any spaces that we might think about using for a garden, maybe we could create a community garden. And they took me to, into the projects, Section 8, HUD housing, 55th and Vine, I don't know if we had Philadelphians here. And they showed me an abandoned street that had short dumping all over it and raging drug activity, a wall where, you know, this tag where all of this drug activity was like kind of expressed in graffiti. And we started to clear the street. And it was, you know, I wasn't paying attention much to the drug activity. It was like a lot of people had said this about this whole experience. It's a 60s hippie thing, you know, like, guy's got a ponytail, he's white in a black neighborhood, just leave him alone. He'll be gone in 3 months, okay? He's just trying to get, you know, his hippie thing done. So the kids and I, you know, I got a truck and I got a couple shovels and I got tree companies to give me wood chips to, you know, throw onto the vacant lots so kids wouldn't be walking on toxins. There's a lot of lead paint in a lot of these houses that were broken down, and there was a lot of lead and heavy metals in the soil. So with one thing and another, this guy who had another nonprofit, a housing nonprofit, was walking by with a woman and introduced me and said, "This is Kyle," and Kyle said, "We have this suburban church, Mission Philadelphia TV program. Do you need any help?" And I said, "Do I need any help?" So she said, "What do you need?" I said, "I need a bulldozer to get this stuff out of here, and I need some plants, and I need boulders, and we need to build a garden." And she said, "When do you want to do this?" He said, "I bring these kids down every third week in June after school, and there are 40 or 50 kids. We raise about 20 grand, 25 grand, and it's yours." And I said, "Okay." And she came down in June. This was probably in the spring when I was talking to her, and we built a garden. And the kids in the projects were the workers along the white kids from the burbs, and that was the beginning. This went on for about 10 years. LeMoyne Purdy, a block captain down the corner, passed by and looked at me, and she said, "Who are you? You know, like, what are you doing in my neighborhood?" And I told her what I was doing in the neighborhood, and she said, "I have a drug house a block away from here that I've been working with the city for 20 years to get torn down. It just got torn down. Can you build a garden?" My traditional answer to every question that was ever asked to me is, "Sure." And so we went over to the site, and there was I never built the gardens. I mean, there was a program, 46th and Market, called CMAC, that was African immigrants, kids that were African immigrants that were getting their GEDs, and they were in this program, so I approached them, and they said they needed community service, so I said, "Come on out and build a garden." So every week they would come out and build that garden. Jackie Bingham, who's a social worker, one development down, got wind of what was happening and said, "There's this huge property here, would I clean it up?" And I worked with some 8-year-olds, and it was just too massive a task. And then all of a sudden, there was some drug shootings, and 3 or 4 guys got killed on that site. Everybody abandoned the site. And LeMoyne, who had asked me to build this garden, the garden before, and Jackie, both had lost grandchildren. No, LeMoyne lost her son in a shooting. She watched him get killed in the corner. And Jackie's kids were in Reading, and she lost 2 grandbabies in Reading from gun violence. And they said, "Let's build a children's memorial garden." And the garden was built in dedication to all the children in the community that had been murdered accidentally or on purpose. We had a fabulous dedication ceremony where we had these wood flowers and the kids painted signs for the kids that they knew that had been murdered. And we put these wood signs, you know, the huge field of wood flowers, and dedicated this garden. Then Joanne Manuel showed up one block in the other direction, and she said, "What am I, chopped liver? Everybody's getting a garden. I don't have a garden." And we went over. She had a really problematic site where there was a speakeasy and a drug house, and we sort of we built a garden there and managed it, but there wasn't enough social dynamic around the site to really maintain it. There were successes and failures. The real pièce de résistance was in North Philadelphia, Hussein. People came to work in this organization because they found out about it. We try to keep ourselves under the radar screen and not be too much in the governmental political scene. And that really was very successful. Hussein found us, and he was a guy that was fussing in a restaurant, and he's really kind of an eco-freak and running around foraging and all these vacant lots in the city and collecting bugs for his reptiles and all that kind of stuff. And he said, "Can I really work with you?" And he lived in North Philadelphia, set up 2 mini farms. He was very gifted at growing food. And we had so much food that the kids started to load it in a wheelbarrow and wheel it around the community and give it away. Some of the more entrepreneurial kids charged a delivery fee. Some of the more entrepreneurial kids charged a per pound fee. And the kids called themselves the Veggie Kids, and they were in business. And back to West Philadelphia, and another block captain, Anita Dunbar, said, "You know, like, it looks like you're having success growing food with kids, not only butterfly gardens. So I got a site to show you." And she walked me down a driveway, and there was this huge property that was overgrown with weed trees, and it had oil tank kind of things from basements dumped. And Anita said, "This is going to be our next garden." And I said, "You know, like, this is even too much for me." And it was about 3/4 of an acre. And the city looked at it and said, "This would make a fantastic," I try to keep away from the city, but they were doing a master plan for open space at the time. And they said it would make a fantastic community space. And they came in with, engineers and pulled the oil tanks out of the ground and took the toxic soils away and put groundwater wells to monitor groundwater. And I stockpiled, like, after the winter, the fall leaves that came off of the trees in huge industrial trucks. I had a buddy who was in the landscape business, and he dumped all these leaves on the site. And then after about 2 years, we had 2 feet of leaves. And then we brought in mushroom soil on top of that, so we were trying to operate on top of the toxins without touching the toxins. And all of a sudden, we had 3/4 of an acre of food. Joanne turned to me and said, "This is too much food. We can't use it programmatically." So the 3 block captains sort of sorted out the harvest, washed, the kids would wash and harvest and package and weigh, and we started distributing food on these blocks. And Joanne said, "This is absurd. This food has value. We're setting up a farmer's market, and we're selling this food." And the women started to sell the food, and they were selling it below market value. It became very, very obvious that there were a lot of churches around the community, and the churches, they were always struggling with revenue. And I suggested that in a couple of these churches that we build gardens and that we start farmers markets inside the church, and that on Sundays we could really raise some money. In one of the churches, Penn Medical School had a free clinic for uninsured patients, for uninsured people in the community. And and they would flock there on Monday nights, and all of a sudden I had at my disposal 20 or 30 Penn Med students. They're pretty intense creatures, Penn Med students. And I asked them if they would consider, instead of their hypertension unit, just throwing pills at all of their clients, if they would consider the farm that we were developing outside of the church and use the food. And there is an organization called New Wave in Connecticut, and they already had what they called an RX fruit and vegetable prescription program. So in essence, we were trying to introduce the concept to Penn medical students to use food instead of pills. If you've ever, I don't know how many doctors there are, if you've ever looked at the medical system and tried to change it from pills to food, it's an uphill battle. But the women in the community started to cook, started to get nutritional advice, started to do juicing seminars, started to harvest our stuff and create recipes out of it. And all of a sudden, in the black community, diabetes and hypertension is epidemic. I mean, it's absolutely off the charts. So there is a great impact that we can make on using food in this system. So the point at which we are is I've got those 3 block captains amassed about 25 people in the community, and they said, let's meet on a monthly basis, and let's call ourselves Neighborhood Foods, and let's incorporate ourselves as a nonprofit, actually a nonprofit that has cooperative status in Pennsylvania law. And they did that, and they got, we actually got a USDA grant, a Farmers Market Promotion Program grant, and they set up 3, 4 more farmers markets at the YMCA in West Philadelphia, North Philadelphia. They set one up at the church where the med students were, and at the farms. All of a sudden, we had 4 farmers markets going strong. Now, understand that this entire system was created as a children's gardening program. I'm a landscape architect by training. I don't really know sophisticated food stuff, but so as people began to come and ask if they could work at the Urban Tree Connection, I got some pretty spiffy college kids who were going to save the world through growing food in the inner city. And I had 2 sensational farmers who were training the kids in the hood how to do all the farming. So this is a very sensitive point that I'm going to talk about now. So essentially, I'm a white guy, and I was bringing a lot of college kids who were essentially white into the system, who were technologically extremely trained, operating in a black community. And the traditional end point of this entire dynamic is that, that the white people go away, they finish what they're doing, they've had enough, and the black community essentially hasn't advanced or remains exactly the same. So we started a dialogue, and at this point the organization is at about 14 people. It's about a $500,000 to $600,000 organization. It's going on for a decade and a half, and people are looking at me saying, we love you, but you're going to be 75, and why don't you leave? And we'll get somebody else who's younger and different, and to run this organization. So, we began this whole retirement process, and I turned to everybody standing there, and I said, if you don't consider what a technology transfer is into this community, as all of you guys, including myself, peel off, this is going to be an absolute pure disaster. And what happened was that Noel asked a very high-powered lady, a black woman who was working at a very large nonprofit in Philadelphia, who has a master's in social work, came from her previous job and said that she really wanted to do field work. She was not interested in doing administrative work anymore. Excuse me. And Noelle started to work with the women in the community. And I mean, this is a micro-enterprise thing. We're turning lettuce into dollars, and people are getting trained in how to do the cooking part of it, the medical dialogue around the diabetes and the high blood pressure, all the crop production, all the soil testing, all the marketing and inventory, and managing all of this food. We're talking about hundreds of pounds of food, hundreds of thousands of pounds of food. So Noelle is now the new executive director of this organization and is focused on taking every job that traditionally I sort of filled with people coming to work in the organization, with people in the community. That's the end point. The lecture that happened here was a guy talking about the environmental condition of the lake. He used an expression called intermingling of cultures. He said, very interestingly, that the reason that this community works, this bubble that we're in here, is that the expats and the Mexicans really have goodwill toward each other and work together to solve problems and to do things. And this is this exact system that I am describing to you in Philadelphia. What happened was the phone started to ring because corporations have community service days. You get a call from Vanguard, and Vanguard says, we got 150 employees that have got to do 8 hours of community service. What can you do? And the answer to that is, sure, bring them along. And so that happened, Citibank, Chipotle, the laundry list of corporations and all of the types of corporations is extraordinary. About 1,000 volunteers a year. So that represents people from the outside sort of coming in and working inside the community and building the community. The thing that was so remarkable at the end of the day is that the Mission Philadelphia kids every Christmas would panic and say, where are the Christmas presents coming from for the kids in the projects? And they would go out shopping and they would create, all these presents for all these kids in the hood. And springtime came and they would say, barbecue time, and they'd bring barbecues down. And there was this relationship that developed between people that were coming from the outside and people that were living in the community. And they were really not defining who was from the outside and who was from the inside anymore. It was just, how do I describe the phenomenon? When people put their hands in the dirt and start working the dirt and start gardening, it's very difficult to identify socioeconomic, high end and low end. It's just a bunch of people digging in the dirt, which is really, in essence, what happened. How are we doing time-wise? We have 10 minutes? All right, so I didn't present the way I thought I was going to present it all. My notes are still over here because I was told that it was really like a half an hour and I was going to do 45 minutes. But it's extremely important. It was not developed as an organization. It was developed as a set of activities which, from a magnet point of view, attracted people, both the recipients of the activities and people who were looking and observing the activities. And that people started to come at me and say, is this a model, and is it transferable? And I would say, this is my life, and I don't think of my life as a model, and I don't think of my life as transferable. I think of my life as, what I do every day. So I was forced to look at the components that drove this model. The black women, the power of the black women in the community were the absolute underpinning. These women in this welfare community that I lived in were holding this community together. They were keeping their kids safe. They were keeping them off the streets so they didn't get shot. They were keeping them from drugs and getting them into high-end private schools in the burbs with financial aid. I mean, it was extraordinary what these women did. They just had no idea how to deal with the drugs and how to deal with the vacant lots and how to deal with the fact that the city had no resources to point in their direction. So when I started to point these minor resources in their directions, they mobilized around this issue. And it was an extraordinary mobilization. And it could not have been done without these women. The kids, I got the women by hanging out with the kids. This is an intergenerational set of activities. Okay, so the kids, I started as sprouts, so anywhere from diapers to, kindergarten. And they would water and plant seeds and do all that kind of good stuff, and then they would graduate into the veggie kids. They'd get their own plot, and they'd get their own harvest, and they'd get their own ability to march the food around the community and sell it. And then we got the work-ready kids who were the teenagers who, there are federal programs that give kids minimum wage for the summer, for 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 6 weeks. And those kids graduated from our veggie kids into this work-ready program, and they got, for that 6 weeks, $1,000. And a lot of those kids sort of came back year after year. And when the parents saw that these kids were functioning in the system, it was like, again, like a magnet for them. The parents began to show up. And this is what began to, build the system inside the community from an intergenerational point of view. All right, there are a lot of ways to continue talking about the details of this. I've already here been approached by two people who said that they were interested in having this dialogue lakeside. And that was kind of what I was curious about. I don't think I have the stamina to run around building these gardens, but if you think about land, if you think about the kids, and you think about the fact that there are seniors I live in San Antonio, you live in San Antonio, and I'm watching at the base of the lake 2 fields in corn, and then I'm watching down Jesus Garcia, another field with horses that had corn last year, and then on Banderas, below Caracara, there's a field that was put into corn. There's vacant land all over the place that's being used for food production. So somebody must be doing the food production, and I call them the elders in the community. These are the guys, and mostly guys that I'm seeing, who have the technical capability to produce food, and they're doing it. So there's not a great jump to, taking this to the next level. Also, a comment that was made to me which is quite fascinating, which is the crafts quality to Mexico is an issue of generational transference. I mean, glass blowing, bead, whatever the crafts are in Mexico, they have to be taught. The elders have to teach the young people how to do it. And I'm beginning to think that agriculture is just another craft, like glass blowing. So it has to be taught. And if it's not taught, it will be, the kids will not garden, Let me stop here. And if there are questions, let me answer questions. If they're not,
Thank you. So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. A mic will be brought to you. Stand up, hold it close, and just ask questions, not so much commentary, please.
Okay, thank you. It's a wonderful talk. I'm very inspired. But what I wondered is, sometimes when community organizations go in and improve lots, suddenly they become marketable and business comes in. How did you avoid that?
So I turned to a bunch of lawyers on my board halfway through this process, and I said, this is all lovely, but we don't control the ownership. I squatted on there were 29, 30 lots involved in this process that made up 7 acres. And I said, is there any way to own any of this land? And in Philadelphia, they have what they call sheriff sales, and they auction land off. And if a land can be forced onto the sheriff sale, I went to a sheriff sale where one of my lots was listed and bought it and threw it into a holding company beside the nonprofit. And then this is more sophisticated or more technical than we need to go. The housing agency in Pennsylvania created a Pennsylvania conservation law that enabled developers to buy derelict buildings and without ownership conversations or environmental conversations. If the developer put his money in and fixed the building, he could go back into the court system and get a deed and sell and get his money out. We didn't have a building on any of our properties, but we tried it on vacant land, and it worked on the farm. So we now, over a period of 3 or 4 years, have the deed to our farm. So that's like, 2, 3 acres. And then we did that again. The answer to that is, and so this land is owned by the women in the community, which is unheard of. That means this group of women sitting there, poverty, on welfare, on Medicaid, can make a decision to sell a property for $30,000, $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 and decide what to do with that money. I can't begin to tell you what the power of that is when, it's kind of upon you. So that, it's much more complicated than that because 40,000 vacant lots is, ownership is like unclear title, public properties department, redevelopment authority, like a million people have their hands in that.
Over here?
Is it feasible to transfer this technology or this idea to Mexico? When we get the Mexican kids up and running?
Well, I've asked a very young Mexican woman, 24 years old, and I said, you have, what's your thought? And she said, my cousins who are in high school, and this is more high-powered, more middle class, are looking for things to do. They're looking for community service. They're looking for content-driven, meaningful things. Okay, and you have to stop thinking about, like germinating seeds and watering plants. The components here are vast. We're talking about medical dialogues. We're talking about culinary. We're talking about cooking. We're talking about selling, inventory, money management. We're talking about a whole, which means that if it happens in this small community, somebody's going to have to understand what the food system is, how these restaurants are getting food, whether this is even for that purpose or just for orphanages or for people who cannot afford food. All of that is a discussion. My feeling is that, I'm watching the kids and know kids really well, teens specifically, and my opinion is absolutely we can do this. Yeah. And I think it was more when Barbara spoke and introduced, this was so many months ago, and introduced us to this young Mexican woman who was going abroad for her degree. They had already started here a teen group of kids. I don't know what the purpose of that program was, but this young Mexican woman had already organized a weekly kids group. Okay.
Other questions? Okay, well, he's available, so you can come up and say hi. Thank you so much. Well, we'd like to see you all next week.